Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today with the President's Lecture Series, Honor Professor Lecture Series. And a professor is a person who has earned the respect of their colleagues. And today we have Professor Pat Hurley. On Pat Hurley's bio, she instructs us she was born in southern New Mexico and grew up in El Paso, Texas. Her parents, of course, were avid outdoors people who instilled in their girls a passion for nature and a taste for wilderness adventure. Professor Hurley said she took these lessons on to the University of Texas at El Paso, where she majored in biology and minored in geology. She received her bachelor's degree in 1970 and her master's in biology in 1972. After getting her master's degree, she went to work at several short-term jobs and eventually became a teacher and a director at a Head Start. She eventually became a curriculum designer at El Paso Community College. And then when that grant-funded position ended, someone sent her a want ad from Missoula, Montana, that said a tribal college was looking for a curriculum designer to help develop new programs. So that tribal college was Salish Kootenai College. Pat was interviewed and hired, and she's been here since 1979. So good for us. Her personal life revolves around her daughter and her granddaughter and good friends, she said, who love hiking and kayaking. Pat is such an amazing individual. I've always been impressed with her. She is multi-talented. She's a scientist. She's an environmentalist. She's a watercolorist. She's a silk painter. And then today I complimented her on her green socks, which I said, pull her whole outfit together. And she said, oh, I made them. I'm learning to knit. And so Professor Hurley, of course, is multi-talented, as I said. She is currently a fine arts major in SKC, saying she's realizing a long-held dream. Please welcome Professor Pat Hurley.
Thank you. I'm going to take an approach to talking about plants that has a fairly long tradition of going out into nature and people trying to find some sort of personal meaning in the things they see in nature. It's something people have done since in almost all cultures and throughout time, and I hope you'll indulge me while I try that for myself here. So I'd like to talk about what plants have taught me. The first lesson was that all of the years that I was a biology major, I was really planning on chasing hawks and owls through the woods and so on. And I saw plants as wallpaper, places to perch, food, pretty. And at some point, because of my teaching here at the college, I had to start really learning them and start sharing those ideas with students. So I started looking more closely. And there's an evolution in the way one approaches, whether it's plants, butterflies, whatever, where the next step in the evolution is naming things. And there's a really good reason for naming things, because once you name them, you look at them. And whether or not it's their spiritual name or the name that that fern happens to know itself by, when we give a name, whether it's a common name or a Latin name, we give it recognition as an individual. But if you stop there, you're just a stamp collector. And I was a stamp collector for a while. Okay, recognize that one, I want a new one now. Okay, recognize that one, I want a new one now. And then at some point, it occurred to me that by looking more closely, I could ask questions of those plants, and they would answer those questions. Or if they didn't, there's this lovely thing called Google Scholar. And so I began to question, why is it built that way? Why is it living where it lives? What are the constraints of its environment? What are the advantages it has in its environment? Why does it sting me? And in asking those questions, I started taking really great pleasure in those plants, and more importantly, because I guess I'm sort of a natural born teacher, it's no fun knowing something if I can't tell somebody else. And so fortunately, I have classes I get to tell those things to. And it's a great pleasure. This quarter is especially my favorite quarter because I spend 4 days a week in the field with students. And it just doesn't get better than that. So my first lesson then has been to approach nature with a sense of childlike wonder, like my granddaughter here, and start really trying to look at individual plants and trying to understand them. And in the process, maybe taking a few personal lessons from them, which I'd like to share. The other 7 lessons. Next one, the first of the next 7 is no creature is insignificant. Aldo Leopold wrote about this plant. It's one you see all over the place if you look down hard enough. It's called Draba verna, or the whitlow grass. Aldo Leopold wrote, "He who hopes for spring with upturned eye never sees a thing so small as Draba. He who despairs of spring with downcast eyes steps on it, never seeing it. He who searches for spring with his knees in the mud finds it in abundance. Draba asks and gets but little allowance of warmth and comfort. It subsists on the leavings of unwanted time and space. Sand too poor and sun too weak for bigger blooms are good enough for Draba. After all, it's no spring flower, but only a postscript to hope. Draba plucks no heartstrings. Its perfume, if there is any, is lost in the gusty winds. Its color is plain white. It wears a sensible woolly coat. Nothing eats it. It's too small. No poets sing of it. Some botanist once gave it a Latin name and then forgot it. Altogether, it is of no importance, just a small creature that does a small job quickly and well." Well, I beg to differ with Aldo Leopold. I don't think there is such a thing as an insignificant or unimportant creature. When Rick Everett and I were talking about this the other day, he pointed out that if we gathered up all of the Drabas growing here on campus and weighed them, they'd weigh as much as a tree, perhaps. There's millions of them out there. And something like that is bound to have an ecological impact on our campus lawn, if no place else. So they are important, they are significant, they're just little. And little is not a reason to not care about them. So then I went and started trying to find some information about them. The only thing that's really well understood, I think, is their germination, because they're certainly easy to grow in the laboratory. These here are their pods, and they shed their seeds. They're probably shedding their seeds right now. And those seeds are going to lay in the ground. They need to go through a warm period of the summer and then a cold period of the winter, and then they will germinate quickly even as the snow begins to melt next spring. And they'll turn around and do their thing. What eats them? We still don't know. What pollinates them? Well, I've heard wind, but that doesn't make sense. Wind-pollinated flowers don't look like that. They have their anthers sticking out. They don't bother with petals. That's not a wind-pollinated flower. Other books say that they're self-pollinated, and to me, whenever I read that they're self-pollinated, that's probably another way of saying, darn if we know how they pollinate. It's possible. But again, Rick suggested there's this tiny little minute insect that wanders around flightless that nobody ever really sees, and suspect that probably is fairly important in pollinating these small flowers. It's called a thrip. And I'd show you a picture of a thrip, but well, they're not that cute. So no creature is insignificant. There's a reason for everything, and if we want to take a larger life experience from that, then is the people in our classes who are too small, who think differently from us, who maybe try harder and get less done. Those are all people who deserve respect and a little extra time, like the Draba, the Blue-Eyed Mary, and the Tiny Trumpet. Lesson number 2, be in the world. John Muir wrote that most people are on the world but not in it, having no conscious sympathy or relation to anything about them. Well, John Muir didn't know tribal people very well. And I think one of the great things about my experiences here on the reservation is the attempt to maintain a connection with the environment that created the culture. And one way of looking at that is in ecology, we talk about keystone species. That is, the species that sort of holds the whole ecosystem together. In this example, it's a salmon in the northwestern rivers. But those stones around the keystone creature also hold up it, as well as it supports them. And so all of them are important. The keystone concept has been applied to cultures as well. Many tribes have a cultural keystone species, whether it be bison or salmon, or here, the bitterroot. And of course, today is the bitterroot dig. And it would be fun to be out there. I really enjoyed it last year. What was great about it was not just seeing the elders digging, but seeing teenagers and seeing children. And it's a wonderful thing to see people holding on to those cultural keystones and knowing what they taste like and learning what they're about. I would suggest perhaps that maybe it should spread a little bit further to some of the other plants that are culturally important, those side stones that are holding up the rest of the culture. Arrowleaf balsam root is blooming all over the hillsides right now. It's also called spring sunflower, and it's good to eat. Its stems, flower stems, have kind of a peppery, cucumbery taste, and Eva Boyd was telling me that what she'd really like to do is have somebody just drive her out to a good field and just leave her there and let her just sit and eat. One of the interesting things about some of these plants, such as bitterroot, Turner and Ignatz did a study and noted that those traditionally used plants that are continually used and collected in the traditional way actually increase their populations. And their thoughts on that was the idea that people tinned the plants. They redistributed their plants, they weed around the plants, they make sure that those plants stay healthy. So when people stop using those plants, the plants stop coming back. So in order to be in the world, it's a reciprocal relationship with the plants around us and the people around us too. Actually, I want to go back here a little bit. So some of the reasons for eating these things, again, from some of the other readings, is arrowleaf balsam root in particular. One eats the stems, but one also eats the baked roots. And Eva was telling me that when she was a child, they ate the raw roots as well. And traditional people don't separate medicine food from food. And as we're doing nowadays in our society, we tend to think of, okay, I'm going to eat blueberries now because they've got good stuff in them, not because they're good. Or maybe I'll take a blueberry pill and separate out all of the chemicals that are supposed to be good for me. On the other hand, these traditional foods all have really important chemicals in them. For instance, the arrowleaf balsam root, first of all, has a good deal of fiber in it, but it also has something called inulins, which are simple sugars that break down into fructose while they're being baked. They also contain antimicrobials. So these plants are able to not only provide calories, but they provide the kind of nourishment that you don't find at the grocery store necessarily. And diabetes and things like that were not very common in the old days because many of these plants were anti-diabetic, essentially. This is one of those horrible slides that nobody should ever show. But I wanted to share it with you just a little bit. This is from the Turner and Ignatz paper. And if you want a copy of this slide as well as the bibliography that I've used, I have some handouts that I'll give you at the end of the class, or lecture. At any rate, one of the beautiful things about this is it's a review of the literature showing how people have been able to sustainably harvest things for thousands of years with not only without reducing the populations, but actually encouraging and increasing the populations of culturally important plants. So pick up a copy if you like. Next lesson, look for opportunities to grow. There's always a chance to grow. I'm growing right now. There's something called spring geophyte. What a wonderful word, geophyte, earth plant. And these are plants that have stored away all of their energy from last summer so they can burst forth at the first sign of spring, sometimes even before the snow is gone, and reach up and get the sunlight, the food, and all the things they need before the other plants close in over them. And these are two that you probably already know. Yellow bells, which were blooming here on campus, and glacier lilies, which are kind of beginning to sort of march up the hills now. The North Crow, they're pretty much done blooming, but as you go up the canyon, there's more and more as you go. And again, their ability to store food has been really important to traditional people and to bears. These plants are harvested by a lot of creatures, people, bears, other things, digging them up because, again, there's this rich source of food in the bulbs or the roots, depending on the type of storage unit they use. But there's not just spring geophytes will find special opportunities to grow. For instance, these are two plants that I kind of always get excited about seeing too. The stone crop here on the right is one that'll grow in the rocks where absolutely nothing else can grow. It's too dry for anything else. Not even mosses can sort of come and go there, and you'll find them just happy as clams, soaking up the sun, storing water, what little water comes along in their succulent leaves, and spreading out, shedding their seeds all over the place, and decorating rock slides with yellow flowers. And then on the other side of things, in the darkest places in the forest, you see the rattlesnake plantain. I prefer to call it the rattlesnake orchid because it is an orchid. It's the most common orchid around here. And it has a special adaptation for living in dark places. Can you see what it is? That white stripe down the middle actually gathers and bounces the light around inside the leaf so that whatever little bit of light gets to it is enough. It's not going to waste any of it. It's like a mirror flashing the light around inside. And they do beautifully in dark, shady places. According to one of the flower books that I use, children like to tear off the end of the leaf and blow on it and make a little balloon. I've never been able to get the balloon thing to work. But they also make good Band-Aids. When I was a child, I seemed to have a special affinity for stinging nettle up until I was about 10. If it was around, I would find myself in the middle of it to the point where I think I pretty much inoculated myself against it because eventually it seemed like, it itched for about 10 minutes and it'd be all over. And then I moved up here and I saw this tall plant. I hadn't seen stinging nettle for a long time. Saw this tall plant, went over, and looks like stinging nettle. I touch it gently, no sting. Wonder what that is. And I turned away and bumped it with my elbow. Yeah, stinging nettle. The thing is if you pet stinging nettle, it won't hurt you. If you bump it, it will hurt you. It's its defense against being eaten, and it's a fairly effective defense. It grows pretty much undisturbed by wild animals. On the other hand, it's one of the best foods out there in the forest. The problem is these. It's one of the most elegant designs I've ever seen. Up here, this right here, is a silica hair that's hollow, a glass hollow tube with a point on the end. At the base, it's attached to a gland that contains, and there's arguments in the literature, at least formic acid. That's the stuff that is in an ant bite. But also other people say it carries histamines and various other sorts of chemicals as well. But the bottom line is, when you brush against it, the sharp sting or the sharp point sticks in you, breaks off, and then as you pull against it, it squeezes that ampule of poison into your skin, and you start itching. But you know, like I say, it's a really good food, and the good news is this poison is immobilized by heat very quickly. You can blanch it, you can saute it for a few minutes, poison's gone. I don't recommend eating it raw, although there is a festival every year in Dorset, England, where they do eat it. The contest is to eat it for an hour, whoever can eat the most in an hour, raw. Oh, there is a saying, what is it, mad dogs and Englishmen? At any rate, once you do disarm it, it has more vitamin C, A, calcium, potassium, and protein than spinach does. And oh, by the way, it's good. I know because I collected some last year. Oh, by the way, use gloves. I didn't. But it was worth it. It's also been considered for a number of medical purposes. It's being considered even as we speak. It seems to have an anti-cancer effect, especially on prostate cancer, taken as an internal thing, not applied. Finally, the other thing that's wonderful about stinging nettle is that it has strong bast fibers. That is, there's support fibers in the stem that once you've disarmed it and beaten it, seems painful, winds up making fibers that are really good for cordage. And this fiber has been used because stinging nettle grows all around the northern hemisphere. All the cultures in the northern hemisphere have at one time or another used stinging nettle as a fiber or cordage. So don't judge too harshly. Yeah, it hurts when you bump into it, but it's not a weed. It's kind of a gift. Next lesson, take care of others. Now there's a lot of plants that would fit that category of taking care of others, but this is one of my favorites. It's yarrow. A simple, plain, woolly little plant that grows everywhere. There's one growing in my driveway. People consider it weeds, they clean it out of their gardens and so on. It's one of the few native plants that hangs on in the face of a monoculture of knapweed. And yet there's yarrow in the middle of all that knapweed. Feisty little guy. Deep taproot. And what I think is really pretty flower head. They're related to sunflowers, but it isn't real obvious from just looking at them. But what's really special about them is if you look in any field guide, which my favorite one is right here, and I'll just read to you what she has to say, if I can read in the dark here. This aromatic herb has been used for thousands of years as medicine, fumigant, insecticide. Yarrow leaves have been applied externally to treat burns, boils, open sores, pimples, earaches, sore eyes, mosquito bites. The tea has been taken internally to treat colds, diarrhea, fevers, diabetes, and headaches. But the most important thing I think to remember about yarrow when you're out walking in the woods and things is that Frances Vanderburg called it bleed weed when we were talking about it. And I asked her why, and she said, well, you take it, you crushed it up, you put it on a cut that's bleeding, and it stops it like that. And sure enough, it has the chemicals. This is acylane, there we go. It's a chemical named for the yarrow itself, and it's one of the most effective styptics or blood stoppers out there. And the reason some people say that it's named Achillea is because the tradition is Achilles, right, was fighting in the Trojan Wars, and he used yarrow to stop the bleeding on wounds and so on. But there's a tradition, again, because it grows all around the northern hemisphere, there's a tradition of it being used in all tribes. By the way, it was found in Neanderthal graves. And one of the questions is was it being used as a flower, or was it being put in the grave as kind of a medicine for the person? Or did it just fall in? But that seems unlikely. So every time I see a yarrow, whether I pick it or not, I thankfully don't need to use it very often for bleeding. It is nice to know that it's there and it's almost everywhere. And it's sort of like it's got your back all the time. So take care of others. You know, this is a plant that I didn't have much respect for when I first moved here, because I came from West Texas, and there was this ridiculous little cactus. I mean, it was nothing like the big cacti we see in the Southwest. And it's this little tiny thing. It's called sometimes potato cactus or the fragile prickly pear. You'll find it growing around Perma and out in the plains and that area. And mostly people kind of get annoyed because it sticks to their boots, it sticks to their dogs, it's how it moves around. But then I stopped and started thinking, wait a minute, it's a succulent. It's living someplace that has, in some years, 30 degrees below zero weather. How the heck does it get around like that? Because when water freezes inside of a plant full of when water freezes inside of a plant, it rips the cells to pieces. It kills it. That's why a tomato looks so bad on the day after a frost. And yet these are plants that store great quantities of waters in their stems. So what's going on here? Why is it this cactus is growing here and none of the others do? And sure enough, Google Scholar helped me out with that answer in that if you look at the cactus, it's beginning to fluff up now, but if you look at it during January, so it's this kind of pitiful little raisin of a cactus. It's sort of all shriveled up and red looking. And what it does is as winter comes along, it not only gets rid of the water, but it also builds up the sugars, actually creating a kind of antifreeze in its cells. And then it starts generating this red color, which in a lot of plants you'll see in the spring, acts as a kind of sunscreen to prevent it from doing too much photosynthesis when it doesn't have the resources to finish the job of photosynthesis. So it has this sort of two-way approach of avoiding freezing, and because of that, you can find Opuntia fragilis all the way up into Canada, and it's the only cactus that you'll find that far north. Fascinating little guy. I even let one come home with me on my boot, and now it's living in my yard. And finally, the last lesson, I couldn't resist this one. Sometimes it's okay to like a scallywag. And in fact, these are the scallywags. Fairy slipper, the pink one there, is blooming up North Crow right now. And I get a little silly when I see them because, well, come on, they're orchids. And in fact, I was somewhat surprised coming from the desert to find that in western Montana, there's something on the order of, depending on how you count, 12 to 18 species of orchids growing here. One of them being the one I mentioned before, the rattlesnake plantain. These are two of the more obvious ones. And the reason they're scallywags, now there are some really nice orchids out there that give a fair trade for their efforts. But a lot of orchids, including these two, trick their pollinators. In this particular case, the fairy slipper and the lady slipper puts out this delicious smell, and a wasp comes along and goes, this is where I'm going to find some food and nectar. Goes in, wanders around inside, no nectar. There's nothing there, and so they turn around and go out, all covered with pollen. Then they smell that smell again. Wasps aren't smart. And they go do it again. And so they keep moving the pollen around simply by being confused by the smell. It could be worse. There are orchids in Europe that convince male wasps that they are female wasps. But watch Private Lives of Plants, Volume 3, send the children out of the room. Now, like I say, there are some, the rain orchid, the bog orchid, the rattlesnake orchid, all of those actually do give fair trade. So at least in terms of pollination, some are not as much of a scallywag as others. But orchids, which are one of the most recently evolved flowers, have also come up with a way of saving more energy. By the way, there's 2 flowers here, there's 2 leaves here. Each lady slipper only has 1 leaf. So those are 2 separate plants. That's important to notice because that's all the photosynthesis that's going to be going on. There's this association between plants and fungus in the soil called mycorrhiza. And the mycorrhizal association is all about the plant providing photosynthetic products, sugars and things, and the fungus then bringing in water and nutrients. Well, again, these little scallywags have sort of short-circuited the process. They don't provide much in the way of sugars, but they have completely gotten rid of the actual absorptive cells, which are called root hairs, and they let the fungus do all of the work. And so that's one of the reasons orchids are pretty hard to grow. But they're just sort of freeloading out there, and we give these things to our mothers. So these are some of the lessons I've learned while studying some of the plants. When I thought about doing this talk, I kept coming up with more and more and more, and I figured in a dark room I might wind up being the only one still awake. So I limited myself to 8 lessons. And again, the first lesson is discovering that I'm kind of a naturalist, kind of a nature geek, but I'm enjoying it. So here's some of the literature. Again, it's on the other side of the handout that I have. And most of all, I thank you for your patience and your attention.
Professor Hurley, will you entertain questions?
I will certainly entertain questions. The answer is usually I don't know, but let's go for it.
I have a question, Pat.
Yes, ma'am.
What's you hike a lot,
I do.
and you have a hiking group, because I've come across them every now and then. What's your most favorite place to hike, and why?
I have got a super soft spot for North Crow. I really do. And I take students up there. Well, actually, a student the other day said something to the effect of, we were looking for a plant, and we were just going on and on. She says, Pat, do you know where you're going? And I said, can you multiply 32 times 6? And she did. I said, that's how many times I've been up here. On the app, or somewhere in that general vicinity. I just can't get enough of North Crow.
And how high up do you go?
Sometimes I get past the first waterfall. Usually with students, that's about as far as we can go. The highest up I've been is just before it starts turning and climbing to go up to the Piper Crow Pass. I've never been up to Piper Crow Pass.
We have a big patch of the fairy slippers, and it's in a really bad place. I mean, it's good for the fairy slipper because it loves to be there, but I'm so afraid that it's going to be destroyed. And is it appropriate to transplant it if the same ecological conditions are in the place where you're considering?
Is it?
It's like,
I guess my instinct is to say leave them alone.
yeah.
Because they have such a delicate relationship with the soil that sometimes even the act of picking the flower will damage the plant. So
I just keep my eye on them.
just keep your eye on them.
Yeah. Thanks.
Why is it called rattlesnake plankton?
You know, I've thought about that. There's a couple of possibilities. Common names crack me up. I don't know what a lot of them are about. Stinging nettle, I get that one. There's 2 possibilities on the rattlesnake. One is that stripe maybe looks something like it, but I think more likely what it is the dry fruit almost looks like a rattlesnake rattle, and I guess if you hit it, it would make that noise. I don't know. I wouldn't have chosen to name it that way.
Is it in the same family as the other plankton that we see around that you can put on for bee stings?
No, that's why I think, I prefer to call it rattlesnake orchid. It's an orchid. And plantains are a different family entirely.
Pat, what's the skunk cabbage plant? Tell us about that. It's everywhere.
That's fun.
Well, skunk cabbage this is western skunk cabbage. You didn't want to know the Latin name, did you?
Yeah, it's all over.
Okay. In wet places. Yeah. It's the largest, fun facts to know, it's the largest leaf native plant in the western United States, because the leaves get to be, about that big sometimes. It is a member of the arum family. You may have heard, like, the so-called largest flower in the world is that giant arum that grows in the tropics. They all have funky smells because they're all designed to attract either beetles or flies, and that's where you get the skunk smell. Now, the eastern skunk cabbage actually is able to generate heat and warm up the land around it. I was hoping that was true of western skunk cabbage, but apparently it's not. But it's also, of course, been used for years, centuries, as, I guess, wild aluminum foil for baking things, because the leaves are so large. So those are a few things I know about skunk cabbage.
And the eastern one is 72 degrees when it comes up, so it heats, just like what you said.
Another question?
Do you see much, is it arnica around here?
We have a lot of arnica, Arnica cordifolia, especially the heartleaf arnica. The one that's usually used in medicine is the mountain arnica, but as far as I can understand, the chemicals are pretty much the same in both.
Has anyone found a use for knapweed?
Tell him, Rick.
Honey.
Well, there's one explanation, I don't know if it's true or not, that some people say that it was brought in to sort of fill in that summer gap for bees. Rick, are you aware of that?
Yeah, a misguided individual decided to bring it in because they felt the bees didn't have enough to eat.
And I hear that knapweed makes really good honey also.
It does. Mm-hmm. And there was some interest for a while in using it to make pelletized fuel, but unfortunately it has some phenolics in it that a lot of people are allergic to, so it's not a good thing to burn in your house. But I remember Bearhead once saying this about another one of the weeds that I think is probably true here. As soon as we find a good use for knapweed, it's all going to start dying. So please, somebody hurry and find a good use for it. Yes, ma'am.
Are there plants that naturally repel, like nuisance insects, for example? They're always wanting to spray around housing for what they consider nuisance insects like spiders and ants. So would there be certain plants that we could just put around the dorms and housing that would repel them?
Catnip is considered one of those, I believe. I'd have to think about some others, but I've heard catnip.
Yeah, right.
But then you have
Cats.
druggy cats hanging around.
And then we go home.
Especially if it's a mountain lion.
Actually, an interesting side note on that is one of the papers I read about stinging nettle talks about using stinging nettle, or actually wanting to keep stinging nettle around in your garden because it supports ladybugs and some of the other things on its insects until your insects show up, the ones you want to get rid of, and so they kind of act as a reservoir of beneficial insects.
The yarrow you showed was white. Is it a new breed that they're coming out with pink and yellow and all different colors of yarrow?
Yeah, it's been cultivated for home growth in different colors. However, that pink color shows up as a natural variation in nature too. It's a really pretty one.
So,
Elizabeth?
I think it's a pussy toes in my yard, but I didn't know what it was. But it is very, very tiny and grows in very, very dry places. And then later I saw at like Home Depot, they had a cultivated version with pink flowers on it called Pink Pussy Toes. So I was just curious, is there a particular use for pussy toes, or?
I'm not aware of any particular human use for pussy toes, but they certainly make good ground covers. There's several species of them around too, at least 3 that I can come up with real quickly. But I've not come across any particular food or medicine use of them. Lori?
I won't ask any more. This is the last question I'm going to ask.
Oh, this is fun.
Are people still collecting St. John's wort for tranquilizers? At one time, people were collecting that all over the reservation. I mean, is it still being used as a natural
You
tranquilizer?
could still buy it at the grocery or at the
Yeah.
drugstores and so on. So I would think it's still out there in use, but I have not heard of people collecting it on the reservation for quite a while. I know some good patches. Well, thank you for your attention.
To tell you that once Pat wrote a little paper ode to a dilettante, and you heard all of the things that she does and is knowledgeable with. She also plays the cello and bakes a wild Harvey Wallbanger cake or something.
Actually, I was going to make reference to ode to a dilettante. The bottom line, by the way, in that was people should really support dilettantes because they're the ones coming up with all the ideas. They just don't have the time to follow through on them.
With that, thank you, Professor Hurley.